Deputy Clare Daly to move the second reading motion, that is, that the bill be now read second time. Deputy Clare Daly.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I move, and I suppose I find myself in the unusual situation of moving a bill that isn't mine, and I unfortunately can't claim the credit for it. This bill is, of course, as a result of the efforts and the work put in by Senator Colette Kelleher and her team, and indeed the members of the Seanad Civil Engagement Group. I have to say huge credit also has to go to NASC, Oxfam, the Irish Refugee Council also, who worked with Senator Kelleher on this bill. But because it had passed through the Seanad and there was no, I suppose, equivalent grouping to get it into the Dáil, the Business Committee very kindly agreed to schedule it in this slot and asked me to take it forward here today. I'd like to acknowledge as well the role of Deputy Fiona O'Loughlin, who held a briefing on this issue earlier this afternoon and is incredibly supportive of its provisions. So, I suppose in supporting the bill, as Senator Kelleher said when she introduced it in the Seanad, this is really a modest proposal. It really came out of a substantial, and I'd have to say very unnecessary, erosion of the right to family reunification under the International Protection Act introduced in 2015. When the Act was commenced, it removed the discretionary right that had existed under the old Refugee Act to apply for extended family members to come to Ireland, and it also introduced a one-year time limit for refugees to submit an application for family reunification. Now, all this bill simply does is to broaden the scope of the definition of family members eligible to include a dependent grandparent, parent, brother, sister, child, grandchild, ward or guardian of the sponsor, essentially reinstating Section 18(4) under the repealed Refugee Act 96, but without the discretionary element for the Minister. It's not exactly earth-shattering. It won't result in recognised refugees successfully applying to have 30 of their healthy, strapping cousins, uncles, aunts, sisters, whatever, coming to live with them. All that it does is allow, in circumstances where somebody has come here and, for example, left maybe an elderly or disabled parent or with nobody to care for them, that they can apply for that person to come here. It would, for example, allow, say, a Syrian mother of a 19-year-old daughter who's dependent on her to come here to Ireland. She can apply for that to happen. At present, she can't, and I think that's something that would be absolutely abhorrent to most parents. As the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission pointed out at the time, the definition under the 2015 Act of a member of family who may enter and reside in the state in Section 55 is far too narrow and notably excludes dependents. I think more recently, in its review of the provisions of the Act, IREC pointed out that the European Court of Human Rights, in its jurisprudence on Article 8 of ECHR rights, has held that the right to family life extends beyond the nuclear family to relationships between grandparents and grandchildren, between uncles and aunts, with nieces and nephews, and between adult siblings. And bearing in mind the fact that this is Europe's highest court, and they're of the view that family is beyond the nuclear, it's hardly surprising then that since the 2015 Act was commenced, there's been a massive upsurge in cases before the courts. Between January and June of this year, there's been 18 such cases in relation to reunification before the court. So I put it to the Minister that maybe it's time that you start listening to the NGOs in this sector, to the members of the Seanad and to these organisations, because the UNHCR, for its part, has repeatedly argued for a liberal interpreting of family for the purposes of family reunification. As they say, the family plays an essential role to help refugees rebuild their lives and can provide critical support to adapt to new and challenging circumstances. Restoring families can also ease the sense of loss that accompanies many refugees who, in addition to family, have lost their country, network and life as they knew it. Family support in this sense goes beyond any traditional and cultural understanding of a family, but will include those who rely and depend on each other. And that's all we're talking about here. It makes sense. You know, it's really so obvious that it hardly needs saying. but sometimes when they're so obvious we can't just see them. And I mean, let's be honest, the family reunification provisions under the old Refugee Act weren't exactly liberal to begin with, so it's kind of shocking really that the government removed them in the International Protection Act. I think we have to say and be very clear, the numbers, unfortunately, in my opinion, but if it maybe might reassure the government, but the numbers we're talking about here are actually tiny. Between 2008 and 2016, before the Irish Refugee Protection Programme was set up, Ireland granted asylum to a total of 3,485 people. Add into that those who have come in under the IRPP in the past couple of years, and we're looking at about 6,000 people in 10 years. I mean, we have to put it seriously. Can the government not find it in their hearts to allow a tiny number of people, probably 0.1% of the population over a decade, apply to have their dependent parents, grown-up children or siblings come and join them? When the Refugee Act was in operation, the numbers of family members that recognised refugees applied for to come and join them was roughly 2. That was the average. That's what we're talking about here. So I really can't understand the government's resistance to it. And I think it's utterly appalling that we stand over a system currently where someone can come here as an unaccompanied minor, get their status after a period in time, and for some of them it might take a number of years, and they can't apply to have any of their family come and join them if they get their status after the age of 18. So they leave their family under the age of 18, maybe sent out with every penny the family had to try and get them to safety. They maybe spend years trying to find their family members in a conflict zone. And obviously it's not as easy as just putting a stamp on a letter and hoping it'll get there. War dislocates people, it separates families, so it takes years. And then you find them and you apply for them to join. But because you got your status when you were over 18, the isolation that you were sent into as a child remains into your adult years. And it's absolutely heartbreaking to think that there are people in that situation. I think critically as well, the bill also removes the time limit for the making of an application once international protection status has been granted. This is entirely sensible, and I think, as Oxfam and the Refugee Council point out, it's not unusual for people to take a long time to find their relatives. So this is an actual very important provision in the bill. I'd like to pay tribute to the work put in by Roisin Hines, completing the incredibly important study into refugees' own experiences of the family reunification system since the changes were brought in to the 2015 Act. And she tells of the real stories and the devastating consequences of these measures. She talked about a father who spent months frantically trying to track down his daughter. Then he found her, only to find out he couldn't apply because the 12 months limit had passed. We know of the people who spent years languishing in direct provision, and if that wasn't bad enough, we've had the added trauma that, as a consequence of the delay in direct provision and the delay in those people getting their status, parents who've then subsequently tried to apply to have their children join them often find, and there's one quoted in the study where one of her daughters had turned to the age of 20 at that stage, and the other children refused to leave her alone, and the mother had to remain here alone. We heard in the Shannon heartbreaking stories of elderly and sick grandmothers being left in squalid conditions on the island of Lesbos, and I know you were there yesterday, Minister, at the Justice Committee when we discussed the conditions in Camp Mora in Lesbos, that they're so bad that children as young as 10 are trying to take their lives inside the camp. Overcrowding is so extreme that asylum seekers spend as much as 12 hours a day waiting in line for food that's mouldy. 80 people for a shower, 70 people for a toilet. Workers talking about raw sewerage leaking into the tents where children are living. The BBC, we know, went on a visit there last summer, and while they were there, 2 people were stabbed to death in the queue for food. And yet our legislation at the moment says that a recognised refugee in Ireland who was a family member in that situation has to maybe resign themselves to leaving an elderly grandmother there. It's absolutely shocking. I mean, having your family around you is so important. We all know that instinctively. And I know what the Minister is going to say to me. Oh, sure, look, we recognise that family reunification is important. Sure, aren't we recognising it in the humanitarian admission programme that's part of our commitment under the Irish refugee programme? You're going to tell me that this has broader criteria in terms of family members than the reunification under the International Protection Bill, but it's limited to people who are currently in conflict zones, and it's operated under the Minister's discretionary power. In other words, it's substantially actually more limited than what we're proposing here today. And I know that this argument was repeatedly made by the Government in the Seanad when Senator Kelleher moved her bill, but that was an argument that was rejected by our colleagues in the Seanad, and I trust and hope that the same thing is going to happen here in the Dáil, because what the Government is attempting to say and stand over is a two-tier international protection system in this country. It's absolutely incredible that we've managed to designate some people fleeing war and persecution as more deserving of care and compassion than other people fleeing war and persecution. It's a ranking system for wars, nearly. If you're fleeing from one of the top 5 as selected by the Western powers, well, you can get treated as a full human being. But having one kind of family reunification for one type of refugee and another for a different type of refugee, I mean, come on, that's absolutely disgraceful in this day and age. We have one of the lowest refugee recognition rates in the world. In 2016, 65.6 million people around the world were displaced and seeking refuge. We granted refugee recognition to 646 of them. That's 0.0009% of the total. That's it. And yet we're one of the richest countries in the world. I think it's a pathetic number, to be honest. I think, to quote Senator Kelleher, who's here now, she wasn't here when I was ringing her praises at the start of the bill, but she can read them back on the transcript. But to quote her again, we're looking at here is a very modest proposal. And if the Government can't find it in their hearts to support it, I really give up. I really do. I don't know what you're at, because, you know, I think it was heartening to see the level of support, the level of emails as a result of the campaign initiated by Oxfam, the Refugee Council and NASC, of citizens appealing to politicians at this time of year to get this bill passed and to allow families to be reunited together. It's striking that this is in some ways indicative of new politics, that we've had the Business Committee taking the decision to introduce an entirely new process in order to get the bill which passed through the Seanad in here before us in the Dáil. And I would like to thank the Ceann Comhairle and indeed all the members of the Business Committee who came up with this creative approach to get us here today. But they didn't do that to have it rejected. They got it here to try and undo the wrongs of the 2015 legislation. That's not speculation. It's a fact. It's a fact as a result of the studies done under the research. Now, I'm not going to take up too much time, but we also need to look at, when people get here, what are the supports for them under family reunification? Because I have to say, having dealt with many families in these situations, when they get here, there's absolutely nothing there for them in many instances, with the result that we've had people fleeing war in Afghanistan who've ended up going back to Afghanistan because they ended up being homeless on the streets of our country. That is utterly shocking, but it's true. There are no designated organisations to take in its entirety the process of family reunification, for example, where the sponsor is an unaccompanied minor, with the result that TUSLA, who maybe work with that child when they're in care, have been given the job without the resources to deal with it in a proper way. So a young person who was separated from their family, maybe at 13 and 14, sent to the West, separated, tries to bring their mother over here. Their mother hasn't seen them. They left as a child and now they're a man, but they're really only 17 or 18. And their mother comes here with no English, never having left the country, and they're kind of dumped, more or less, on the care of that young man who has to do everything, running around social welfare, getting a PPS number, trying to, if they're lucky enough to get a house, collect the bins for that house, and all of the stress in trying to rebuild a family relationship, having been separated for so long in an alien country where you've never been outside it's utterly challenging anyway that we don't need to put barriers there. And I want to salute Crosscare, who've done tremendous work in highlighting the shortcomings there. So again, in thanking Senator Kelleher and the Civil Engagement Group, I think we owe it to our Shannon colleagues, but particularly to the children and the vulnerable families. So I'm so glad we gave refuge to allow them be reunited with vulnerable family members who desperately need their help, and I really hope the Minister reconsiders.
Thank you, Deputy. I now call on Taras Dodge